Hey guys, tonight we are taking a slow, sleepy journey back in time, way back to the land of Kush, ancient Nubia, nestled along the Great Nile River south of Egypt. Imagine the air thick and shimmering with a heat that radiates from the very sand beneath your feet. The sun, a relentless golden disk in a vast cerulean sky. You can almost feel the dryness, the way the light here seems to bleach all the color from the distant rocky jebels. It's a place where shade is a currency more valuable than gold, and water a divine gift. Honestly, with our modern sensibilities and perhaps a deep, deep love for precisely controlled indoor climates, you probably wouldn't survive a week here without a serious attitude adjustment and a very, very large hat. It's a world away from your comfy bed, that's for sure. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as you settle in, maybe drop a comment to let us know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's always fascinating to see our little community of night owls and history buffs stretching across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The warmth is the first thing that truly embraces you. Not like a gentle hug, but more like an oven, giving you a very committed full-body welcome. You're standing on the edge of what feels like an endless expanse, the Nubian desert. The year. Well, that's a wonderfully fuzzy concept here, isn't it? We're drifting into a realm that existed for millennia, a civilization that saw dynasties rise and fall in neighboring Egypt and often had a rather direct hand in those proceedings. The Kingdom of Kush, a name that echoes with the strength of archers. Indeed, one of its many monikers from antiquity was Ta Seti, the land of the bow. Its warriors were renowned, their skills honed by the demands of their environment, and no doubt the occasional disagreement with their northern neighbors. You shield your eyes not just from the glare, but from the sheer scale of the place. The sky isn't just blue, it's an intense, almost violet hue at its zenith, fading to a hazy white near the horizon where heat waves make the distant sparse acacia trees dance like blurry apparitions. Mirages here aren't just an occasional visual trick. They're practically a full-time hobby for your eyes, promising cool water where there's only more hot sand. Sunday. You can taste the dust, a fine ancient powder that seems to coat everything, a souvenir from winds that have whispered secrets across these dunes for eons. This is the challenge: to exist, to thrive, to build not just shelters, but entire cities in a place where the sun reigns supreme, where every drop of moisture is precious. How did they do it? How did they engineer comfort, or at least a manageable existence, without the humming servants of electricity we so casually command? That's the gentle mystery we're here to explore. As you take a few tentative steps, the sand crunches softly under your imagined sandals. You see the lifeblood of this region in the distance, a shimmering ribbon of deeper green and blue, the Nile. It carves its way through the ochre landscape, a testament to persistence, carrying stories and sustenance from the heart of Africa. Along its banks, life clusters, but even here the air is heavy. The Kingdom of Kush was one of the earliest complex civilizations in the Nile Valley, with roots stretching incredibly deep back to at least 2500 BCE. It wasn't just some provincial backwater. It was a major player, a center of rich culture, trade, and unique traditions, sometimes ruling Egypt itself during its 25th dynasty. These weren't people simply enduring the heat. They were mastering their environment with an ingenuity born of necessity. You might notice even in this mental reconstruction, the quality of the silence. It's a profound quiet broken only by the sigh of the wind, perhaps the distant cry of a desert bird or the buzz of an insect that clearly didn't get the memo about energy conservation in extreme heat. It's in this silence that you can almost hear the thoughts of those who came before, contemplating the angle of the sun, the direction of the prevailing breeze, the very earth beneath their feet. They were the original architects of cool, the pioneers of passive climate control. You wander towards what might be the faint outline of an early settlement, the kind that predates the grander cities we'll explore later. Perhaps you see evidence of simple circular huts not unlike those found in other parts of Africa, but here even these rudimentary structures would have needed some clever thinking. Some early desert dwellers might have known that the Acacia tortilis, or umbrella thorn acacia, wasn't just good for its sparse shade, but its bark was sometimes used in traditional remedies for heat exhaustion. Though you wouldn't want to try brewing that up yourself for your modern-day headache Without an expert guide, obviously. Probably stick to an aspirin if you've packed one in your imaginary time travel kit. Historians still argue whether the earliest large-scale Nubian settlements, those that eventually grew into towns and cities, were direct responses to dramatic climate shifts that made desert life more challenging for nomadic groups, or if they grew more organically from those traditions, with people gradually settling around the most reliable agricultural land and water sources along the Nile. It's one of those fascinating chicken or egg scenarios of ancient history. Did the environment push them together, or did their own societal developments pull them into denser communities, which then had to seriously tackle the climate problem head-on? Regardless of the initial spark, the challenge remained the same: that sun, that immense, powerful, life-giving, and potentially life-threatening sun. It dictated the rhythms of life, the very shape of their homes, and the layout of their communities. Your journey tonight is into that shaping, into the subtle, intelligent ways the ancient Kushites turned the harsh glare into a softer, more livable glow. You can feel that sun, can't you? Even in your mind's quiet theater, it's a palpable presence pressing down. To understand how the Kushites engineered their cool comfort, you first have to truly appreciate the landscape they called home, this vast and often unforgiving territory of Nubia. It wasn't a gentle rolling countryside dotted with babbling brooks, oh no. Think more along the lines of nature's sternest architectural phase, stark, dramatic, and not particularly interested in making things easy for its inhabitants. The land stretches south from what the ancient Egyptians considered their own border at Aswan, near the first cataract of the Nile, deep into what is now modern Sudan. We often speak of Lower Nubia between the first and second cataracts, and Upper Nubia further south, each with its own character, but united by the desert's powerful signature. Imagine the Nile not as a wide, placid highway, but as a determined traveler itself, fighting its way through formidable granite barriers, the famous cataracts. These aren't gentle waterfalls perfect for a postcard. They are turbulent rocky rapids making continuous boat travel a bit of a nightmare. This geological reality meant that Nubia wasn't one homogeneous strip of land, but a series of fertile pockets and basins often isolated by these rough stretches of river and the encroaching desert. The arable land, that precious life-sustaining soil, was a narrow ribbon, clinging to the riverbank, sometimes just a few hundred meters wide before the sand and rock took over completely. This scarcity, this concentration of life along the water, shaped everything where people live, what they ate, and how they interacted. It was like living in a very, very long, thin oasis. The deserts flanking this ribbon are legendary. To the west lies the vast Libyan desert, an ocean of sand and rock. To the east, the Nubian desert proper, eventually giving way to the rugged Red Sea hills. These weren't just empty spaces, they were formidable barriers, isolating Nubia to some extent, but also paradoxically sources of incredible wealth. For Nubia was, and this is a crucial point, a land rich in gold. The ancient Egyptian word for gold, nub, or NBW, is thought by many to be the very origin of the name Nubia. Extensive mining operations, particularly in the eastern desert, brought forth a glittering stream of this precious metal that fueled the Kushite economy, adorned their rulers, and made them a coveted trading partner, and sometimes a target for empires like Egypt and Rome. You can almost picture the glint of it, a warm yellow against the sun-baked earth, a stark contrast to the cool, life-giving blue of the Nile. The climate itself was a character in their daily drama. We're talking seriously arid, especially in Lower Nubia, where rainfall was and still is an extraordinarily rare event. If you were waiting for a refreshing shower to cool things down, you'd be waiting a very, very long time. Customer service for rainfall was notoriously unresponsive in these parts. This hyper-aridity meant that reliance on the Nile was absolute. Further south in Upper Nubia, there was a bit more seasonal rainfall, allowing for some dry farming and pasture land away from the immediate river valley. But the sun's dominion was rarely challenged. And the heat. Oh, the heat. It wasn't just hot. It was a deep, penetrating heat during the day capable of baking the landscape and anyone foolish enough to be out in it without protection. But then, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the desert's thin atmosphere would release that stored warmth with surprising speed. Nights could become quite cool, even chilly, especially in the winter months. This diurnal temperature variation, the dramatic swing between daytime furnace and nighttime coolness, was a key factor the Kushites learned to harness in their building designs, a natural rhythm they could tap into for passive cooling. You might also encounter the infamous Habub 1's fierce dust storms that could sweep across the land, reducing visibility to near zero and filling the air with a choking curtain of sand. Not exactly ideal for keeping your meticulously swept courtyard pristine. The Nile then was more than just a river. It was the central artery, the source of all fertility, the primary highway despite the cataracts, and a profound spiritual focus. Its annual inundation, the flooding that brought nutrient-rich silt to replenish the fields, was vital, though perhaps less predictable and geographically widespread here than in the broader floodplains of Egypt due to the cataracts and narrower valleys. Archaeologists debate the exact extent of desertification in Nubia during the Kushite period and how rapidly these changes in the Saharan landscape might have forced adaptations in their agricultural practices and where they chose to build their settlements. Were they constantly battling an encroaching desert, or had the environment stabilized into the arid patterns they so skillfully managed? The sands keep many secrets. Life, of course, found a way. Doom palms and acacia trees dotted the landscape, offering precious shade and resources. The river teemed with fish crocodiles, the original grumpy, scaly landlords of the Nile's prime real estate, and the occasional hippopotamus whose territorial grunts might have been an unwelcome addition to a quiet evening. It's whispered that certain smooth, cool clays found only in secluded Nile coves, different from the usual pottery clays, were prized not just for making beads or figurines, but for slathering on the skin on the very hottest days. An ancient, all-natural cooling paste. Think of it as a spa day Kushite style, though perhaps not quite as relaxing, with a lurking crocodile nearby and definitely not dove-scented. This direct interaction with the natural materials, understanding their properties, was fundamental to their survival and comfort. They didn't just live on the land, they lived with it, attuned to its subtle signals and its powerful demands. This deep understanding of their desert embrace was the very first step in crafting cities that could breathe. So you're standing there feeling the dry desert air of the Nile, a distant promise of life, and you begin to notice the very ground beneath your feet. It's not just sand and rock. Close to the river, the earth is richer, darker. The famous Nile silt, a gift from distant lands carried down for millennia. This very mud was the humble hero of Kushite architecture, the key ingredient in their quest for coolness, the mudbrick. It sounds almost too simple, doesn't it? In our age of space-age polymers and climate-controlled, everything plain old mud seems, well, a bit basic. But for the ancient Kushites, and indeed for many civilizations across the ancient Near East and Africa, mudbrick, or adobe as it's often called, was a revolutionary technology. It was abundant, it was versatile, and most importantly for our sleepy exploration, it held a secret to thermal comfort. Imagine the scene. The sun, your constant companion on this journey, is already climbing its rays, beginning to bite. But down by the river flats, there's a flurry of activity. You see people, perhaps whole families, engaged in the timeless process of brickmaking. They're digging up the rich alluvial clay, mixing it with water, drawn from the Nile, not too much, not too little. A skill learned through generations. Then they're adding a temper, a binding agent. This was often chopped straw or chaff from harvested grains, sometimes even animal dung, which, far from being just a rustic additive, actually improved the brick's tensile strength and insulation. It wasn't artisanal gluten-free mud, mind you, but it was a recipe perfected for a purpose. You can almost smell the damp earth, a cool organic scent, in the otherwise parched air, and hear the rhythmic squelch as workers, perhaps children too, tread the mixture with their bare feet, working it to the perfect consistency. It's a very hands-on, or rather feet-on process. Once the clay is just right, it's pressed into rectangular wooden molds, simple, sturdy frames that give the bricks their uniform shape. Then carefully the molds are lifted, leaving behind a neat, wet block of earth. These fresh bricks are laid out in long, orderly rows directly under that relentless sun. And here's where the sun, usually the adversary in their quest for coolness, becomes an indispensable ally. It bakes the bricks, slowly drawing out the moisture, hardening them until they are ready for construction. It's not exactly express delivery on these building supplies. Patience was a key ingredient in ancient construction. Days, maybe weeks, depending on the thickness and the season, were needed for them to cure properly. Now, what made these sun-dried bricks so special for keeping cool? It's all down to a wonderful property called thermal mass. Think of a mud brick wall, often quite thick in Kushite buildings, as a sort of thermal sponge. During the blazing day, as the sun beats down, the dense mud brick absorbs that solar energy very slowly. Heat doesn't just zip through it like it would through a sheet of metal or even thinner stone. Instead, the energy gradually seeps into the brick, warming it layer by layer. By the time the peak heat of the afternoon sun has managed to penetrate deep into a substantial wall, something magical is happening outside. The sun is beginning to set. The desert air, as we've discussed, cools rapidly once that solar furnace is turned down for the night. So as the evening chill descends, the heat that the mud bricks have patiently soaked up all day begins to radiate back out. Some of it radiates outwards into the cooling night air, and some of it radiates inwards, providing a gentle, subtle warmth to the interior, just as the outside temperatures are dropping. This creates a time lag, a delay in the transfer of heat, meaning the inside of a well-built mud brick house stays significantly cooler than the outside during the day and pleasantly warmer, or at least less shockingly cold during the early part of the night. It's a beautiful passive dance of energy and natural climate control system. Moreover, mud brick has relatively low thermal conductivity, meaning it's a poor conductor of heat. It resists the passage of heat, unlike materials that get hot to the touch almost instantly under the sun. These bricks also had a degree of breathability. They could absorb some ambient moisture and release it slowly, which in a very dry climate can contribute to a slight evaporative cooling effect within the home, though this is a more subtle aspect of their performance. Of course, mud brick wasn't without its drawbacks. It's vulnerable to prolonged exposure to water. A rare but torrential downpour or a significant flood from the Nile could be disastrous, causing walls to slump or even dissolve. That's why you'd often see Kushite mud brick structures coated with a layer of mud plaster, sometimes even a lime plaster if available to give them a more durable water-resistant skin. And structurally, while incredibly strong in compression, you can stack a lot on top of them. They don't have the same tensile strength as stone, which influences how large you can make openings or spans without additional support, like wooden lintels or columns. Researchers continue to analyze the precise composition of Kushite mud bricks from different periods and sites to understand variations in their production techniques, the ratios of clay sand and organic temper, and how these might reflect local resource availability, specific architectural needs for different types of buildings, or even evolving knowledge over centuries. It's a testament to its effectiveness that this basic technology was used for everything from the simplest dwellings of farmers to the massive, enigmatic structures like the defufas at Kerma, which we'll explore. Occasionally, if you were to dissect an ancient Kushite mud brick, and please don't actually do this if you ever find one, they're precious historical artifacts now. You might find a tiny bead, a fragment of a faience amulet, or even a carefully placed fishbone deliberately pressed into the clay by the brickmaker. Perhaps it was a little personal mark, a quiet prayer for the strength of the building, or just the ancient equivalent of leaving your initials in wet cement before your supervisor told you off. These humble blocks of baked earth were quite literally the foundation of Kushite civilization, silently working to make life a little cooler, a little more bearable in the heart of the sun-drenched desert. Section 4. You're now getting a real feel for this remarkable material. The humble mud brick understanding its quiet strength, its partnership with the sun for creation, and its clever defiance of the sun's daily onslaught of heat. Now let's take those individual bricks, those patient products of earth and effort, and see them in action on a truly monumental scale. We're journeying further south in our minds, deeper into Upper Nubia, towards a place that was once the heart of a powerful kingdom, one of Africa's earliest urban centers, the city of Kerma. Imagine it rising from the plains, near the third cataract of the Nile, a testament to ambition and ingenuity flourishing for a remarkable 1,000 years, roughly between 2500 and 1500 BCE. This wasn't just a village. It was a bustling capital, a major trading hub, and a center of a unique and sophisticated culture. As you approach Kerma in your sleepy reverie, the first things that might strike you are its defenses. This was a city that understood the need for security, surrounded by substantial mud brick walls, ramparts, and bastions. These weren't just token barriers, they were thick, imposing structures built from countless bricks, each one laid by hand. And while their primary purpose was undoubtedly defense, keeping out unwelcome guests, rival chiefdoms, or perhaps just overly enthusiastic sales gazelles, these massive walls had a secondary wonderful benefit. They created shade, vast swathes of shade depending on the time of day and the sun's angle. Walking close to these towering earthen barriers would have offered a significant reprieve from the direct glare, and the alleys and pathways near them would have been noticeably cooler. The sheer thermal mass of these fortifications, all that densely packed earth, would also have absorbed the daytime heat, acting like a giant thermal buffer for the city within. But the true celebrities of Kerma's architectural scene, the structures that still inspire awe and a fair bit of head-scratching among archaeologists, are the defifas. The word diafifa itself is a local Nubian term for a large man-made mound, or a massive brick building, and Kerma boasts two prominent ones, the Western Dafifa and the Eastern Dafifa. Let's focus first on the Western Dafifa, the larger and more famous of the two. Picture it, a colossal structure of solid mud brick soaring up to perhaps 18 or 19 meters high. That's like a six-story building today, and covering an enormous footprint. It wasn't a pyramid with sloping sides, but more like a massive, somewhat irregular rectangular tower or temple platform. Originally, it's thought to have been plastered with a gleaming white gypsum or lime wash, which would have reflected a significant amount of sunlight, its first line of defense against solar gain. Imagine that brilliant white structure against the deep blue Nubian sky, a truly stunning sight. Now you step inside, or rather you imagine ascending its great staircase, because the main temple or ceremonial areas were on the summit. The effort of climbing those stairs in the heat would have been considerable. The stairmaster of the ancient world, perhaps with slightly higher stakes if you happen to tumble. But once within its embrace, or even within the complex network of rooms and passages that honeycombed its base, if you were important enough to be allowed in, you'd immediately notice the difference. The sheer volume of mud brick walls many meters thick acted as an incredible insulator. The heat from the outside would take many, many hours to penetrate this massive structure. The interior would have remained remarkably cool, a hushed, dim sanctuary from the blazing world outside. It's the ultimate expression of thermal mass at work. The exact purpose of the Western Dafufa's myriad internal chambers and winding staircases is still debated by archaeologists. Theories range from it being the primary temple dedicated to a yet unidentified Kushite deity, to priestly residences, administrative offices, storerooms for valuable goods, or even complex ritual pathways meant to guide initiates or officiants through sacred symbolic journeys. Some of the interior passages are incredibly narrow, almost uncomfortably so if you were a person of particularly generous Kushite proportions. This has led to some whimsical speculation that they were designed by an architect who really didn't like having too many visitors crowding the place. Or perhaps more practically, these narrowings were intended to enhance airflow through a kind of Venturi effect. Though that's a bit of modern fluid dynamics applied with a hefty dose of hindsight. Regardless of their precise function, these internal spaces cocooned within tons of sun-dried earth would have been oases of cool. Not too far away lies the Eastern Dafufa. It's smaller than its western counterpart and situated in the midst of a vast cemetery. This has led most scholars to believe it served as a funerary temple or a monumental chapel associated with the royal burials and the commemoration of ancestors. Here, too, the same principles of massive mud brick construction would have applied, creating a cool, solemn space for rituals connected to the afterlife. The tombs themselves in Kerma are fascinating, with some high-status individuals buried on beds, a distinct Nubian tradition, often accompanied by sacrificed attendants and animals, a rather grim reminder of ancient funerary practices. Beyond these colossal mud brick monuments, the city of Kerma itself would have presented a dense warren of houses, workshops, and public spaces, all nestled within those protective outer walls. While we'll delve deeper into domestic architecture later, you can already imagine how the close packing of buildings would have created shaded alleyways and courtyards, further contributing to the overall coolness of the urban environment compared to the exposed desert beyond. The city wasn't just a collection of buildings. It was an engineered environment, consciously or unconsciously shaped by the relentless sun and the ingenious use of the earth itself. Kerma stands as a powerful early example of how the ancient Kushites didn't just endure the heat. They built against it on a scale that still impresses us thousands of years later, using little more than the mud beneath their feet and an incredible amount of organized labor. You've seen the monumental ambition of Kerma, the sheer audacity of raising such colossal mud brick structures like the Defifas under the fierce Nubian sun. Those massive forms were in essence giant thermal regulators for public and sacred life. But what about the everyday Kushite, the family, living within those city walls or in the smaller towns and villages that dotted the Nile's banks? How did they find their personal cool? Let's shrink our focus from the monumental to the domestic and step into the heart of a Kushite home, into a space that was both an architectural feature and a way of life, the courtyard. This wasn't just an add-on. For many, it was the main living area, the original open plan living, just why with a bit more sand, and significantly fewer discussions about whose turn it was to unload the dishwasher. Courtyard houses are an ancient and incredibly clever design found across many sun-drenched cultures from the Mediterranean to the Middle East, and the Kushites embraced and adapted this form with typical ingenuity. The basic principle is wonderfully simple. Rooms are arranged around a central, open-to-the-sky space. This inward-facing design immediately offered several advantages. Firstly, privacy and security. With a solid outer wall, often with only a single, easily defensible entrance, the home became a sanctuary from the outside world. Good for keeping out not just dust and noise, but also any nosy neighbors, unless, of course, said neighbor happened to own a particularly tall and inquisitive giraffe. Secondly, and crucially for our sleepy exploration, the courtyard was a natural climate controller. So how does a hole in the middle of your house help keep you cool? It seems counterintuitive, doesn't it? You'd think an open roof would just let all the heat in, but it's all about how the space interacts with the sun and the air throughout the day and night. During the hottest part of the day, especially if the courtyard is reasonably deep and the surrounding walls and rooms are tall enough, large portions of the courtyard floor remain shaded. This shaded area doesn't absorb direct solar radiation, so it stays cooler than the sun-baked streets outside. Then, as night falls and the desert air cools rapidly, this cooler, denser air sinks and collects in the courtyard like water pooling in a basin. The courtyard becomes a reservoir of cool night air. The surrounding rooms, which have been absorbing some heat through their own walls and roofs during the day, remember our friend thermal mass from the mudbricks can now benefit. If doors and openings from the rooms into the courtyard are left open, this cool air can be drawn into the living spaces. There's also a phenomenon often called the stack effect or chimney effect that can come into play. As air within the rooms warms up from cooking or just from people being in there, it becomes less dense and wants to rise. If there are openings higher up in the rooms, or if the courtyard itself becomes warmer than the rooms, perhaps when the sun hits it directly at midday, though this effect is more complex, this rising warm air can escape, actively pulling cooler air from the shaded parts of the courtyard, or from lower openings on the cooler shaded outer walls of the house, into the rooms to replace it. It's a gentle, natural ventilation system powered by subtle temperature differences. The degree to which Kushite courtyards were intentionally designed with precise orientations or proportions to maximize these passive cooling effects beyond the inherent benefits of the form itself is a subject of ongoing research and computer modeling by archaeoclimatologists. They're essentially trying to figure out if the Kushites were just good intuitive builders or if they were the ancient world's unsung HVAC engineers. Imagine this courtyard as the bustling yet cool hub of family life. In one shaded corner, you might find a hearth for cooking, the smoke curling lazily upwards towards the open sky. Children's laughter might echo softly as they play games on the packed earth floor. Perhaps someone is weaving a basket or grinding grain, the rhythmic sounds a gentle accompaniment to the day. It's where stories were told, meals were shared, and on those particularly sweltering nights, it's where families would bring out their sleeping mats to catch any wisp of a breeze under the vast star-dusted Nubian sky. The courtyard could also be a little micro-oasis. A strategically planted hardy tree or a few drought-resistant shrubs could offer additional shade and a touch of green. A large pottery jar filled with water left in a shaded spot would provide cool drinking water, and through evaporation from its porous surface would subtly cool the air around it. You might even find specific hardy, fragrant plants cultivated in a corner. Imagine the subtle scent of crushed wild mint or a hardy desert sage underfoot. Not just for a pleasant aroma, but perhaps as an ancient, all-natural bug spray to keep the mosquitoes and other biting insects at bay during the cooler evening gatherings. Definitely a step up from that citronella candle that promises the world, but mostly just delivers disappointment, right? Of course, not all courtyard houses were created equal. The home of a wealthy merchant or a high-ranking official in Kerma or Napata might have been a sprawling complex with multiple courtyards, perhaps one for public reception, and another more private one for the family, possibly paved with stone slabs and adorned with painted plaster. A simpler dwelling for a farmer or artisan might have a smaller, more utilitarian courtyard, but the fundamental principles of shade ventilation and a cool air reservoir would still apply. It was a flexible, scalable design that served the needs of a diverse society. This inward focus, this creation of a controlled microclimate within the home's embrace, was a profound adaptation to the desert's harsh embrace. It allowed the Kushites to turn their backs quite literally on the scorching sun and create a relatively cool, comfortable, and private world for themselves, using the simple elegance of an open space, carefully managed airflow, and the reliable thermal properties of their ever-present mudbrick. The courtyard wasn't just a design feature, it was the breathing heart of the Kushite home. That gentle, managed coolness of the Kushite courtyard, that private little haven you've been resting in, is a precious thing. But life, even in ancient times, wasn't lived entirely indoors or entirely within one's own family compound. So let's imagine you're stepping out from the relative dimness of a courtyard home back into the shared spaces of a Kushite city or town. You brace yourself for the sun's glare, but as you move into the pathways that connect these homes and lead to markets or temples, you might find another layer of clever passive cooling at work: the design of the streets themselves. Or perhaps more accurately, the alleys. Because you won't find many grand, sun-drenched boulevards here, no sir. The urban fabric of many ancient cities in hot, arid climates, including those in Kush, often favored something far more intimate, and as it turns out, far cooler, narrow, winding alleyways. As you turn a corner from a slightly wider thoroughfare into one of these passages, the change can be immediate. The temperature can drop noticeably. The direct, harsh sunlight is suddenly cut off by the tall, close-packed walls of the adjacent buildings. These earthen walls, built from the same hardworking mud brick, we've come to appreciate, extend upwards, creating canyons of shadow for much of the day. It's a simple but profoundly effective strategy. If the sun can't hit the ground, or your head, it can't heat them up as much. Your GPS, if you had one, would probably just give up in these labyrinthine paths and suggest you ask a local camel for directions. The winding nature of these alleys is another piece of the cooling puzzle. Unlike a long, straight street that can act like a solar cannon, allowing the sun to bake its entire length when it's at just the right or wrong angle, a street that twists and turns presents only short sections to the sun at any given time. As the sun moves across the sky, different segments of the alley fall into shadow, meaning no single part gets a relentless day-long roasting. It's like a slow communal dance with the sun, where the city itself seems to subtly shift and adjust to minimize exposure. This dense urban fabric, these closely built structures, also mean that a greater proportion of the building's wall surfaces are shaded by their neighbors. Think about it. A standalone building is exposed to the sun on all sides, or at least three if it's in a row. But in these tight-knit neighborhoods, houses shared walls, or were so close that they cast shadows on each other for significant parts of the day. This reduces the overall heat load on each individual dwelling. It's a bit like huddling together for warmth in the cold, but in reverse. Huddling together for coolness in the heat. Now, what about air movement? Narrow streets can, under the right conditions, act like wind tunnels. If an alley is oriented in line with the prevailing breezes, the air can be funneled through, creating a welcome current. This is the Venturi effect we touched on briefly before. Air speeding up as it passes through a constriction. This breeze, even if the air itself isn't dramatically cooler, can feel refreshing as it helps with evaporative cooling from your skin. On the other hand, these same narrow, winding streets can also offer protection from less desirable winds like those hot, dusty haboobs that could sweep in from the desert. The complex geometry of the city could help to break up and slow down these unwelcome gusts, making life a little less gritty for the inhabitants. Urban planners and historians still debate whether the organic, seemingly haphazard layout of some ancient city sections with their winding alleys was purely due to gradual, unplanned growth over generations. Houses being added here and there as families expanded, paths forming naturally between them. Or if it incorporated an underlying intuitive understanding of environmental control, a kind of collective wisdom shaping the urban form. Perhaps it was a bit of both. What looks random to our modern grid-loving eyes might have had a deep, practical logic rooted in centuries of experience living in that specific climate. As you wander these shaded corridors in your mind, take in the sensory details. The sound is different here, more muted. The boisterous noise of a main thoroughfare fades, replaced by more intimate sounds. The murmur of conversation from an open doorway, the clink of a craftsman's tools, perhaps the soft cooing of pigeons sheltering in a high niche. The light is softer, too filtered and indirect. You might even see in the more bustling parts of a Kushite town, especially in later periods with more trade and resources, evidence of reed mats or pieces of coarse woven fabric stretched between the rooftops across the narrowest alleys like makeshift awnings. It's a communal effort to create even deeper, more consistent shade, sort of an ancient pop-up canopy, but significantly more effective and probably less likely to blow away than those flimsy things you wrestle with at the beach. The walls themselves might be a patchwork of plastered mudbrick, perhaps showing different earthy tones. Some areas worn smooth by the passage of countless shoulders. Others may be retaining traces of painted decoration near a more important doorway. You might pass by a street vendor tucked into a shady nook selling dates, or cool water from a porous earthenware jug, its surface beaded with condensation, a promise of refreshment. Personal space might be at a premium during busy times. You get to know your neighbors very well, their donkeys too, whether you particularly wanted to or not during the morning rush to the market. This approach to urban design is a stark contrast to many later city plans, especially those in more temperate climates that favor wide open streets and grids. While those have their own advantages in a place like Nubia, such a design would create unbearable heat islands. The ancient Kushites, like many of their contemporaries in arid lands, understood that to live comfortably with the sun, you sometimes had to respectfully hide from it, creating a city that was a complex, three-dimensional filter, letting in life and light, but keeping the worst of the heat at bay. You've navigated those cool, shadowy alleyways, feeling the temperature drop, as the tall, mud-brick walls shielded you from the sun's direct assault. It's a relief, isn't it? A testament to how the Kushites shaped their cities for comfort. But now let's consider how you get light into these buildings without inviting that relentless heat to be your uninvited houseguest. Windows, those lovely portals to the outside world, are a bit of a double-edged sword in a hot climate. They bring in light essential for seeing what you're doing, like not tripping over the cat, or in this case, perhaps a sleeping goat, and they can offer ventilation. But they are also prime entry points for solar radiation, which means heat and lots of it if you're not careful. The ancient Kushites, being no strangers to sunshine, understood this dilemma intimately. So, if you were expecting grand picture windows looking out onto sun-drenched vistas, you'd be mostly out of luck. The Kushite approach to fenestration, that's the fancy architectural term for windows and their arrangement, was generally one of careful moderation and strategic placement. The first most obvious tactic was size. Windows in many Kushite domestic buildings, and even in some larger structures, tended to be small. Really small sometimes. Think less window and more modest opening. This is simple physics. A smaller hole lets in less of everything, including unwanted heat. It's a far cry from our modern love affair with vast expanses of glass, which without very clever and expensive coatings and treatments, would turn a Nubian home into a very effective solar oven. The second and equally crucial strategy was placement. You'd often find these small windows positioned high up on the walls, sometimes just below the roofline, a bit like clerestory windows in later architecture. This high placement is wonderfully ingenious for several reasons. Firstly, when the sun is high in the sky, as it often is during the hottest part of the day, a high window is less likely to receive direct angled sunlight into the room. The deep eaves of the roof might also help to shade these openings. Secondly, the light that does enter from high up can illuminate a room more evenly and gently. It reflects off the ceiling and upper walls, diffusing downwards, providing a soft, ambient glow rather than a harsh, direct beam. This indirect light is much less prone to causing uncomfortable glare or bringing with it a concentrated blast of heat. Thirdly, high windows are brilliant for ventilation. Remember how warm air likes to rise? Well, these high openings provide the perfect escape route for any hot, stale air that has accumulated inside the room, perhaps from cooking or just from the general business of living. As this warm air exits, it helps to draw in cooler air from lower down, maybe from a shaded doorway, or from the cooler depths of that central courtyard we explored. It's all part of that natural passive air conditioning system. And let's not forget privacy. High windows let in light and air without letting in the curious gazes of passersby. Good for ensuring nobody could tell if you were still in your ancient equivalent of pajamas at noon, which, without a rigidly enforced 9 to 5, might have been a perfectly acceptable state of affairs for some. The view from these high windows wasn't exactly panoramic, more like a sky snippet, but it served its purpose. The orientation of windows was also critical. You wouldn't typically find a Kushite builder peppering the west-facing wall of a house with numerous large windows. That wall gets the full brutal force of the hot afternoon sun, a time when you're desperately trying to keep the heat out, not invited in for tea. So walls facing the most intense solar exposure would have minimal openings, if any. Any larger or more numerous windows would generally be reserved for walls facing north, which receives little to no direct sun in the northern hemisphere or east, catching the gentler morning sun, or very importantly, facing inwards towards that cooler, shaded central courtyard. Now, what were these windows made of? You can forget about double glazing or even single panes of clear glass. Glass was a luxury item in the ancient world, used more for beads, small vessels, or inlays than for architectural purposes on a large scale, especially in ordinary homes. Kushite windows were often just openings in the thick mud brick walls, perhaps with wooden frames. For coverings, they might have used simple wooden shutters that could be closed against the heat of the day, the cold of the night, or a rare dust storm. Woven reed mats or pieces of animal hide or coarse fabric could also have been hung over openings, offering a way to filter light or block it entirely. While clear glass wasn't on the menu for your average Kushite window, there's some speculation that thinly scraped and oiled animal hides, or perhaps even stretched pieces of treated papyrus, could have been used in some cases to create a translucent covering, letting in a diffused, somewhat eerie glow and probably smelling quite distinctive on a hot, humid day near the Nile. The precise balance Kushite builders sought between admitting sufficient daylight for tasks and excluding unwanted heat through their fenestration, and how this strategy might have varied between domestic dwellings, grander public buildings, and sacred religious structures is something architectural historians still analyze often, using sophisticated digital reconstructions to simulate ancient light patterns and thermal performance. It's a complex equation involving building orientation, window size, and placement shading from other structures and the thermal properties of the walls themselves. The overall effect of these carefully considered windows would be interiors that felt like calm, cool refuges from the dazzling brightness outside. The light would be more subdued, gentle on the eyes, creating a restful atmosphere. It's another piece in the puzzle of how the Kushites didn't just survive, but created comfortable, livable spaces in a challenging climate using intelligent design principles that were deeply attuned to the rhythms of the sun and the properties of their local materials. Their windows weren't just holes in the wall. They were carefully calibrated light and heat regulators. You've seen how those small, high windows of Kushite homes were masters of light management, letting in a gentle glow while respectfully declining the sun's more aggressive thermal offerings. Now, let's drift upwards past those clever openings to the very top of the house, the roof. In a land where the sun beats down with such intensity, the roof is on the absolute front line of the battle against heat. But in the Kushite world, as with so many things we've explored, the roof wasn't just a passive shield. It was an active participant in the daily cycle of heating and cooling, and it often doubled as prime real estate for evening leisure. Unlike the steeply pitched roofs you might see in regions atrimut otritsuyut, Ukrainian for receive, implying heavy rain snow. A lot of rain or snow, the typical Kushite domestic roof was flat or very nearly flat. This makes perfect sense in an arid climate where torrential downpours are rare. Why go to the trouble and expense of complex angled structures when a simple flat top will do? This practicality, born from the environment, opened up a whole new realm of possibilities for how the space could be used. Flat roofs, often constructed using layers of timber beams, branches, reeds, or palm mats, and a thick layer of mud plaster, were a characteristic feature of domestic architecture throughout ancient Egypt and, of course, Nubia. Let's imagine you're observing the construction of one of these roofs, or perhaps just appreciating its sturdy form. First, wooden beams, likely from hardy acacia trees or the trunks of doom palms, would be laid across the tops of the mud brick walls spanning the rooms below. These didn't need to be massive, perfectly planed lumber, but sturdy enough to bear the load. Across these main beams, a denser layer of smaller branches, split palm ribs, or bundles of reeds would be placed, creating a fairly solid deck. On top of this, you might find woven mats made from palm fibers or tough river grasses, adding another layer and helping to bind everything together. And then the crowning glory, a thick layer of mud plaster, much like the kind used for the bricks and wall coverings. This was smoothed and compacted, baking hard under the sun to create a durable, relatively waterproof surface. Now, how did this layered creation help keep things cool? During the day, that top layer of mud, often several inches thick, did what mud does best. It absorbed the solar energy, slowly acting as a significant thermal mass. The sun would beat down on it, and the mud would patiently soak up the heat, preventing much of it from quickly reaching the rooms below. The underlying layers of organic material, the branches, reeds, and mats, would also offer a degree of insulation, further slowing the transfer of heat. It's like a well-made sun hat for the entire house. But the real magic of the Kushite flat roof happened after sunset. As the desert air cooled rapidly, the heat stored in that thick mud layer throughout the day would begin to radiate outwards, specifically upwards towards the clear night sky. This process, known as nocturnal radiant cooling, is incredibly effective in dry climates. The roof essentially exhales all that stored solar energy into the vast coolness of space. This meant that the surface of the roof itself could become one of the coolest parts of the dwelling during the evening and into the night. While the thick walls were also releasing their stored heat, the roof had the advantage of an unimpeded view of the cold sky. And this is where the lifestyle adaptation comes in. What do you do when the inside of your house, despite all your clever architectural tricks, is still retaining some of the day's warmth, but your roof has transformed into a pleasantly cool platform? You go up to the roof, of course. In ancient Egypt and Nubia, these flat roofs were commonly used as additional living and working spaces, especially during the cooler evenings and nights. As dusk settled and the stars began to prick the darkening sky, families would bring their sleeping mats, perhaps a few cushions, and ascend to their rooftops. It became an outdoor bedroom, a place to escape the lingering stuffiness of enclosed rooms and catch any available night breeze. The view would be spectacular unless your neighbor was drying a particularly large and fragrant batch of fish that day. Imagine the scene. A whole town or city, its rooftops dotted with families, the murmur of conversation, perhaps the gentle notes of a lute, or the rhythmic tapping of a drum drifting on the night air. Children might listen to stories, adults would share news and gossip, all under the immense glittering canopy of the Milky Way, which would have been breathtakingly clear without modern light pollution. Privacy, in the auditory sense at least, was probably more of an acoustic suggestion than an ironclad guarantee when your neighbors were just a few feet away on their own roof. The extent to which specific roofing material combinations and thicknesses in Kushite domestic architecture were deliberately fine-tuned for optimal thermal lag and nocturnal radiant cooling, as opposed to being primarily determined by material availability and structural necessity, is still a matter of archaeological investigation and material science analysis. But the outcome was undeniably effective. You might even see some families, particularly during the hottest times of the year, rigging up a very simple breeze catcher on their rooftop. Perhaps a cleverly angled woven mat or a piece of sturdy fabric tied to a couple of upright poles. Not exactly a high-tech air conditioning unit, but any little innovation to coax a bit more of that precious night air over your sleeping form was worth a try. It's the ancient equivalent of strategically placing 3 electric fans in your bedroom and hoping for a miracle cross breeze. Beyond sleeping and socializing, the roof served other practical purposes. It was an ideal place for drying food, dates, figs, grains, perhaps strips of fish or meat, spread out on mats under the hot, dry sun. It could be a workspace for tasks that needed good light and open air, like mending fishing nets or working on crafts. It offered a vantage point for keeping an eye on livestock in a nearby enclosure or watching for visitors. The roof wasn't just a lid on the house. It was an integral, multifunctional, and wonderfully cool part of Kushite life. Section 9. You felt the cool kiss of the night air on a Kushite rooftop, a shared space of slumber, and stars, a testament to their clever adaptation of flat roof technology. This deep understanding of thermal dynamics wasn't just confined to their homes. It extended naturally to the most important buildings in their society, their temples, the very houses of their gods. Let's drift now in our sleepy journey to a slightly later period in Kushite history, the Napatan era, which flourished roughly from around 900 BCE to 270 BCE. This was a time of great power and prestige for Kush, a period when its pharaohs even ruled as the 25th dynasty of Egypt. And the spiritual heart of this mighty kingdom was the city of Napata, nestled around a truly remarkable natural landmark, Jebel Barkal. Imagine this mountain Jebel Barkal rising dramatically from the flat desert plain near the fourth cataract of the Nile. It's not a jagged alpine peak, but a striking sandstone mesa, its cliffs glowing warm red in the sun. The ancient Kushites called it Du-Wab, the pure mountain, and believed it to be the dwelling place of a powerful local form of the god Amun, their state deity. At the foot of this sacred mountain, a vast complex of temples and palaces sprawled, a testament to Kushite piety power. And as we'll explore their understanding of how to create awe-inspiring and relatively cool sacred spaces. Even a mighty god, one imagines, appreciates a bit of a draft when it's consistently 40 degrees Celsius outside in the shade. Many of the temples at Napata, such as the Grand Temple of Amun, designated B500 by archaeologists, were built and expanded over centuries by Kushite rulers. Architecturally, they often drew heavily on Egyptian temple design. No surprise given the close cultural exchange and periods of Kushite rule over their northern neighbor. You'd find massive gateways called pylons, wide-open courtyards, and those impressive hypostyle halls filled with forests of towering columns supporting a high roof. These familiar forms, while symbolic and traditional, also happen to be pretty good at creating a more comfortable internal environment. Think about those pylons, often decorated with vibrant scenes of pharaohs smiting enemies, a classic. Their sheer bulk, constructed from sandstone blocks, would create significant areas of shade at different times of day, cooling the entranceways and the initial courtyards. Speaking of courtyards, we already know how these open-to-the-sky spaces, when surrounded by tall structures, can act as reservoirs of cooler night air and facilitate ventilation for the rooms and halls opening onto them. Then you move into a hypostyle hall. Imagine stepping from the bright, hot courtyard into the dim, echoing expanse of one of these halls. The roof soars high above you, supported by dozens, sometimes hundreds of closely spaced columns carved to resemble papyrus stalks or lotus flowers. The light is subdued, filtering down from small, high clerestory windows, cut into the upper walls, much like those we saw in domestic architecture, but on a much grander scale. The sheer volume of the space is immense. All that height allows hot air to rise and stratify far above the heads of any worshippers, potentially venting out through those high windows or other openings. The thick stone walls and the massive columns themselves possess considerable thermal mass. They would absorb heat very slowly, keeping the interior cooler than the outside for most of the day. The acoustics would be incredible for sermons and chanting, probably less great if a junior priest accidentally dropped a heavy ceremonial sistrum with a clatter. But the Kushites didn't just copy and paste Egyptian designs. They infused them with their own distinct Nubian characteristics and adapted them to their specific location and beliefs. The precise astronomical alignments of some Napatan temples, particularly in relation to the sacred mountain of Jebel Barkal, and specific features like a prominent natural rock pinnacle on the mountain that from certain angles strikingly resembles a uraeus, the divine cobra, and how these alignments might have also factored in prevailing winds or the strategic penetration of light for ritual purposes, are areas of active scholarly discussion and ongoing survey. It's possible that temple doors or specific chambers were oriented not just for symbolic reasons, but to catch a morning or evening breeze that was known to blow from a particular direction at certain times of year, a sacred breeze to ventilate the divine house. Some temple elements at Jebel Barkal were even partially rock-cut, carved directly into the base of the mountain itself. These subterranean or semi-subterranean chambers would have benefited immensely from the stable, cool temperature of the earth, providing truly refreshing sanctuaries from the desert heat. This is geothermal cooling ancient style. Consider also the use of water. Many large temple complexes in Egypt, and likely in Napata too, featured sacred lakes or pools. These weren't just for ritual purification or to represent the primeval waters of creation. They would also have contributed to local microclimates through evaporative cooling, subtly lowering the temperature in their immediate vicinity and perhaps humidifying the dry desert air just a little. The priests officiating in these grand Napatan temples, often performing complex and lengthy rituals, would have certainly appreciated any design features that enhanced comfort. It's humorously speculated by some that the traditional priestly garb of finely woven linen robes, while symbolic of purity, was also just intensely practical. Anything heavier in those vast, cool, but still potentially stuffy stone halls would feel like wearing a personal sauna after a few hours of solemn chanting and processions. The overall effect within these sacred precincts would have been one of profound coolness, dimness, and quiet. An atmosphere designed to inspire awe, facilitate spiritual connection, and underscore the separation between the sacred, ordered world of the temple and the hot, chaotic world outside. The coolness wasn't just a byproduct of massive construction. It was an integral part of the sensory experience, enhancing the sanctity and mystery of the rituals performed within these hallowed Napatan halls and courtyards, all under the watchful gaze of Jebel Barkal, the pure mountain. You felt the hallowed coolness within Napata's grand temples, spaces designed for divine communion and conveniently a respite from the Nubian sun. The architectural wisdom of Kush was indeed profound, adapting to both sacred and secular needs. Now our sleepy caravan of thought drifts further south along the life-giving Nile and also forward in time to the era when the heart of the Kushite kingdom beat in a new capital, the city of Meroe. This period from roughly 300 BCE to 350 CE saw a flourishing Meroitic culture with its own distinct script, which frustratingly for historians is still only partially deciphered. Maybe they left detailed instructions on how to build the perfect air conditioner, and we just can't quite read them yet. Unique art forms and a rather significant industrial reputation. Meroe was situated in a region known as the Butana Steppe, an area that received more rainfall than the arid lands around Napata further north. This meant more vegetation, including acacia woodlands, which provided a crucial resource fuel. And fuel was something Meroe needed in abundance because it became renowned throughout the ancient world as a major center for iron production. So much so that some enthusiastic early archaeologists nicknamed it the Birmingham of Africa. While perhaps a bit anachronistic, the comparison highlights the scale of their smelting operations. Vast mounds of iron, slag the byproduct of this ancient industry, still stand today as silent, dark monuments to centuries of fiery labor. This industrial character presents a fascinating new wrinkle in our quest for Kushite coolness. It's one thing to manage the relentless solar radiation. It's quite another to deal with that, plus the localized heat smoke and general hustle and bustle of a city that's effectively home to 1,000 blacksmiths' forges. The ambiance in parts of Meroe might have been less gentle pastoral riverside settlement and more medieval blacksmith convention with an extra helping of sand. So how did the Meroitic people from the royal court down to the artisans and laborers adapt their living spaces to this more complex thermal environment? It's highly likely that the foundational principles of Kushite architecture we've explored, thick mud brick walls, courtyard houses, strategic window placement, and flat roofs for nocturnal cooling, continued to be staples in Meroe. These were time-tested methods perfectly suited to the general climate. However, the Meroitic period also saw an increased use of red or fired brick, particularly in more monumental or elite structures. The availability of wood for kilns made this more feasible than in earlier, more arid Kushite settlements. Fired brick is more durable than sun-dried mud brick, especially against moisture, but it also has different thermal properties. It tends to absorb and release heat a bit more quickly. This might have subtly altered how buildings perform thermally, perhaps requiring even thicker walls or more emphasis on ventilation to compensate if the cooling lag effect was reduced. The interplay between Meroe's industrial activities, such as widespread iron smelting, and the microclimate of the city, including air quality and localized heat, and how these factors influenced urban planning and domestic architecture is a complex area that archaeologists and paleo-environmental scientists are still working to understand. You can imagine the planners, or perhaps just the collective wisdom of the builders, trying to figure out the best places for the smelting operations. Ideally, you'd want them downwind of the main residential areas, wouldn't you? Or perhaps in a designated industrial zone if such things existed in a formal sense. The fumes and smoke alone would have been a significant challenge to daily comfort, let alone the extra heat pumped into the local atmosphere. Within the residential areas of Meroe, we might expect to see variations on the courtyard theme. Perhaps some homes incorporated more greenery if the slightly wetter climate allowed for more ambitious gardening, creating shadier, more humid microclimates within their private spaces. Maybe ventilation became even more critical, with an emphasis on capturing any prevailing breezes that could help clear the air and offer some relief. Among the ruins of Meroe, archaeologists have found curious hollow ceramic tubes, often cylindrical or slightly conical. Their exact purpose is keenly debated. Some scholars suggest they were part of sophisticated plumbing or drainage systems. Others, more intriguingly for our purposes, theorize that some of these tubes might have been built into walls or roofs as rudimentary ventilation shafts, a sort of ancient attempt at creating air bricks to encourage airflow. Of course, they probably weren't very effective at filtering out the distinct metallic tang of nearby smelting operations, but every little bit of air movement would count. The royal city of Meroe itself, a large enclosure containing palaces, temples, and audience halls, would have undoubtedly employed every known trick to ensure the comfort of the ruling elite. Here, the use of fired bricks, sometimes glazed in different colors, was more common. We can imagine columned halls, high ceilings, shaded porticos, and carefully oriented structures designed to impress visitors, not just with their grandeur, but perhaps also with their surprisingly pleasant internal temperatures. Water features like the royal baths, a somewhat misnamed structure that was likely a water sanctuary or nymphaeum, would have offered both symbolic purity and very real evaporative cooling. Imagine stepping into a beautifully decorated space with pools of water. The air cooler and fresher, a true oasis within the bustling, sometimes smoky capital. Even in their art, the Meroites might have hinted at their preoccupation with the climate. Some Meroitic painted pottery, distinct with its vibrant colors and lively scenes, occasionally depicts figures holding fans or resting under stylized trees. While these could be generic symbols of status or leisure, it's tempting to see them as a subtle artistic nod to the ever-present need for coolness in their daily lives. After all, creating beautiful, functional objects that also happen to make you feel a bit more comfortable seems like a very Kushite thing to do. The legacy of Meroe isn't just in its impressive pyramids or its undeciphered script. It's also in the resilience and adaptability of its people who forged a powerful kingdom and a unique culture amidst the heat of the African savanna and the fiery heart of their own industry. Section 11. You've walked the smoky, industrious streets of Meroe in your mind, feeling the unique blend of desert sun and the heat haze from countless iron forges. It's clear that in such an environment, the quest for coolness would have been even more pressing. And when you think of cooling, especially in a hot, dry land, one precious substance immediately comes to mind: water. That life-giving liquid was for the Kushites not just essential for drinking agriculture, and indeed for those very industries we touched upon, but it was also a fundamental ally in their continuous efforts to create comfortable, livable spaces. Its gentle, cooling kiss was sought after in a multitude of ingenious ways. The mighty Nile, of course, was the primary and most obvious source. We've seen how Kushite civilization clung to its banks, drawing sustenance and life from its rhythmic flow. But what about settlements a little further afield, or during those times when the Nile's flood was less generous? The Kushites were resourceful. Wells were a common feature sunk deep into the earth to tap into the hidden groundwater. Imagine the communal effort of digging such a well, the anticipation, and then the joy and relief when fresh, cool water was finally reached. Discovering a reliable new well was probably the ancient equivalent of finding a surprise $20 bill in an old coat pocket, only infinitely more vital for survival and comfort. The cool water drawn from the depths of the earth would have been a blessing, not just for quenching thirst, but for all the small acts of cooling that make life bearable. Particularly during the Meroitic period, when the kingdom expanded into regions like the Butana steppe, that experienced more seasonal rainfall but were further from the Nile's constant embrace, the Kushites developed an impressive system of water management: the hafir. A hafir is essentially a large man-made reservoir, an enormous basin dug out of the ground, often with raised embankments designed to capture and store precious rainwater when it fell. Some of these hafirs were truly vast, capable of holding millions of gallons of water, transforming arid landscapes into areas capable of supporting agriculture and larger populations. The local Hofer wasn't just a water source. It was likely a vital community hub, a place for watering livestock, collecting water for domestic use, and probably the premier social club and news exchange for miles around. The presence of such a large body of water would also have had a subtle, localized cooling effect on its immediate surroundings through evaporation. The sophistication and extent of Kushite irrigation systems beyond simple well and shaduf methods, that classic counterweighted lever for lifting water, particularly in areas further from the Nile, like the hinterlands of Meroe, and whether they employed more complex technologies like sakias, animal-powered water wheels, extensively remain topics of active archaeological investigation and interpretation of landscape features. But even small-scale canals channeling water from the river or a hafir to thirsty fields would have brought more than just life to the crops. They would have increased the local humidity, supported more greenery, and created cooler, more pleasant microclimates in their vicinity. Every patch of irrigated land was a tiny victory against the desert's heat. Now let's think about how water was used more directly for cooling. We've touched upon the magic of evaporative cooling before, and it was a principle the Kushites understood well. Those porous earthenware jars, ubiquitous in any Kushite household, were more than just storage containers. As a tiny amount of water seeped through the unglazed clay and evaporated from the outer surface, it would cool the contents of the jar and the air immediately around it. A jug of water left in a shady, breezy spot would become refreshingly cool, a simple but effective ancient refrigerator. This principle could be scaled up. Imagine on a particularly scorching afternoon, someone sprinkling cool water from a jar onto the packed earth floor of their home or onto woven reed mats. As that water evaporated, it would draw heat from the air and the surfaces, providing a noticeable, albeit temporary, cooling effect. It's a practice still common in many hot, dry parts of the world today, a timeless bit of low-tech climate control. And what about personal cooling? Beyond simply drinking cool water, bathing would have been a cherished ritual, not just for hygiene, but for the sheer pleasure of sluicing away the heat and dust of the day. Even if it was just a quick splashdown using water from a jar, the relief would have been immense. It's even whispered in the quiet corners of historical speculation that on the hottest nights, some Kushites would lightly dampen their linen sleeping sheets or their headcloths with water, carefully judging the amount so it wouldn't be uncomfortably wet, just enough to provide a delicious, evaporative chill as they drifted off to sleep. A bit like a DIY swamp cooler for your face, an intimate personal negotiation with the night's lingering warmth. In more public or elite contexts, like the royal baths at Meroe, we mentioned water was used on a grander scale. While perhaps not a public bathing house in the Roman sense, this impressive structure with its pools and basins clearly celebrated water. The cool stone, the sight and sound of water, the humidified air, it would have been a true sanctuary, demonstrating the ruler's power and providing a luxurious escape from the heat for those privileged enough to access it. Even smaller decorative pools or basins within the courtyards of wealthier homes would have contributed to this sense of an oasis, a testament to water's cooling kiss, actively shaping the sensory experience of Kushite life. Every drop was precious, managed with care, and deeply appreciated for its life-sustaining and comfort-giving properties. Section 12. You felt the vital importance of water in Kush, not just as the giver of life, but as a constant, cooling companion managed with ingenuity from the grandhaffers to the humble sweating water jar. Now, with that sense of refreshment lingering, let's step back inside a typical Kushite home. We've seen how the very structure, the mudbrick, the courtyard, the small high windows, the flat roof, was a masterclass in passive cooling. But what about the things inside the house? How did the furnishings and the internal layout help the inhabitants find their daily respite from the heat? The first thing you might notice about a Kushite interior compared to our often overstuffed modern dwellings is a sense of space, perhaps even minimalism. This wasn't necessarily an aesthetic choice driven by a desire for clean lines and uncluttered surfaces like a trendy design magazine. It was often a practical response to the climate and to material availability. Fewer possessions meant less clutter to trap heat and dust, and it allowed for better air circulation. Every item likely had a purpose or even multiple purposes. Your trusty stool wasn't just for sitting. It could be a small table, a step to reach something high, or an emergency doorstop in a sudden gust of wind. Archaeological evidence from Kushite towns and villages shows that typical household furnishings included items perfectly suited to their warm environment. Let's start with where you might rest. Beds known as angarebs were often low wooden frames, perhaps with legs elegantly carved, if you were well-to-do or simpler if you weren't. Crucially, the sleeping surface wasn't a thick, heat-retaining mattress. Instead, it was typically made of woven plant fibers, leather thongs, or rope stretched taut across the frame. This open weave allowed air to circulate underneath your body, a significant factor in staying cool during those warm Nubian nights when you weren't already up on the roof. For many, a simple woven mat laid directly on the packed earth floor or on a low mud brick platform served the same purpose. You'd also find stools, usually three-legged or four-legged, and small low tables. Keeping furniture low to the ground was another subtle nod to the climate. Cooler air tends to settle nearer the floor, so sitting or working closer to it would have been more comfortable than perching high up in the warmer air strata of a room. These pieces were generally made of wood, a precious resource, so they were likely valued and well maintained. Woven mats were everywhere, and for good reason. Made from reeds, palm fibers, aloes, or other tough grasses, they were cool to the touch, breathable, and easily portable. If one spot in the house became too warm as the sun shifted, you could simply pick up your mat and move to a cooler corner, perhaps in the shade of the courtyard or near a breezy doorway. They provided a clean, comfortable surface for sitting, working, or sleeping. One particularly characteristic item of ancient Egyptian and Nubian personal furniture you'd likely find is the headrest. These weren't soft, yielding pillows, but rather curved supports made of woodstone or sometimes even ivory for the elite. The idea was to cradle the head and neck, keeping it elevated, and importantly allowing air to circulate freely all around. It might not sound like the pinnacle of comfort by modern standards, definitely not a memory foam pillow, but it wouldn't give you that dreadful hot head feeling in the middle of the night, and it helped to protect any elaborate hairstyles, which were certainly a feature of some ancient African cultures. Storage would be handled by large pottery jars, keeping water cool and foodstuffs safe from pests. Baskets woven in various shapes and sizes would hold grains tools or personal items. Wooden chests, though perhaps less common in simpler homes, would offer more secure storage. Keeping things tidy and put away wasn't just good housekeeping. It contributed to a more open, airy, and therefore cooler living space. The exact use of certain less common domestic artifacts found in Kushite homes, such as small, intricately carved stone plaques or unusually shaped pottery stands, and whether they had functions related to enhancing comfort, perhaps as bases to lift items off the warm floor, facilitating specific domestic activities we don't yet fully understand, or were purely utilitarian, symbolic, or even ritualistic in nature, is often debated by archaeologists as they piece together the puzzle of daily life. It's a charming, if entirely speculative, thought that some Kushite families might have kept a house tortoise, a creature well adapted to the local environment. It wouldn't just be a slow-moving pet, but perhaps its natural tendency to seek out and settle in the coolest, shadiest spots within the home or courtyard served as a reliable, if somewhat unhurried, natural thermometer for the rest of the household. Where's the tortoise under that shady alcove? That must be the best place to sit this afternoon. The internal layout of rooms, radiating off the central courtyard, also played its part. Doorways might not always have had solid wooden doors which can block airflow. Instead, fabric hangings, perhaps linen or woven grass mats, could have been used to provide privacy while still allowing breezes to drift through. This would facilitate cross-ventilation, drawing cooler air from the courtyard through the rooms and out through those high windows or openings on the other side. Even the textures and colors, while not furnishings, would have subtly influenced the perception of coolness. The smooth, cool feel of a plastered mud brick wall, the earthy tones of the pottery, the natural fibers of the mats, all would contribute to a sense of being grounded and in harmony with an environment where simplicity and functionality reigned supreme, helping inhabitants find that much-needed respite from the embracing Nubian heat. You've settled into the cool, calm interior of a Kushite home surrounded by furnishings that whisper of simplicity and a deep understanding of airflow. The very design of the house, from its mud brick bones to its open courtyard heart, is a testament to living intelligently in a warm land. But the architecture is only half the story. The other half is about how you use those spaces, how you move through your day, how you dance to the rhythm of the sun. For the ancient Kushites, like for many societies living in challenging climates, daily life was a carefully choreographed performance with the sun as both the lead musician and the stern conductor. There were no buzzing alarm clocks or rigidly scheduled 9 to 5s. The day's tempo was set by the rising and falling heat. Imagine the first light of dawn in a Kushite village or town. The air is at its coolest, often carrying a refreshing hint of dew even in the dry season. This is prime time. Long before the sun truly begins to assert its authority, you'd see the settlement stirring to life. Farmers would be heading to their fields along the Nile, eager to get the bulk of their strenuous work, plowing, planting, or harvesting, done before the heat becomes oppressive. They probably got more done before 9 a.m. than many of us accomplish all day, especially considering coffee hadn't quite made its grand debut in this part of the world yet. Construction workers busy laying those clever mud bricks or hauling materials for a new temple would also be making the most of these cooler morning hours. Travelers embarking on a journey, merchants moving goods, even priests preparing for early temple rites, all would seize this precious window of relative coolness. The long shadows stretch the air as clear, and there's a sense of purpose, a quiet industry under the gentle morning sky. Then, as the sun climbs higher, its rays growing more intense, you'd notice a gradual shift. By late morning, as the heat really begins to bite, the pace of outdoor activity would slow considerably. This wasn't laziness, it was profound common sense. To exert yourself under the full blaze of the midday Nubian sun was not just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. So the ancient Kushites, like many people in traditional hot climate societies across the globe, embraced what we might anachronistically call a siesta, a period of rest or much reduced activity during the hottest part of the day. You'd see people retreating from the sun-baked fields and exposed marketplaces. They'd seek the shade of their homes, the cool embrace of those courtyards and dim interiors we've explored. Workshops might fall quiet, or the work within them would slow to a more languid pace. This midday lull was a time for lighter meals for mending tools or clothing, in a shady spot for quiet conversation or simply for rest. The official sport during these hours was probably competitive napping, and who could blame them? Children too energetic to nap on command might play quiet indoor games. It's plausible they used painted pebbles, carved dice made from animal knuckle bones, or simple board games scratched onto flat stones or pieces of wood. Ways to stay entertained without generating too much of their own heat or venturing into the furnace outside. The extent to which specific non-agricultural labor, like intricate craftwork such as fine pottery, decoration beadmaking, or detailed metalworking that required intense focus was primarily conducted at night by the flickering light of oil lamps. Or during these cooler parts of the day in Kushite society is still largely inferred from artistic depictions of daily life and ethnographic analogy from similar cultures. As direct textual evidence detailing specific working hours for artisans is unfortunately scarce. But it stands to reason that any task that wasn't time-critical and could be done in lower light conditions would be deferred from the midday inferno. Then, as the afternoon sun begins its slow descent, losing some of its ferocity, you'd feel the pulse of life quicken once more. There's a collective exhale as the worst of the heat passes. People would re-emerge. Farmers might return to their fields for a few more hours of work. Markets might become more animated, the bargaining and chatter picking up as the air cools. Workshops would hum with renewed activity. Perhaps this was also a popular time for fetching water from the well, or the hafir, a task that was both necessary and offered a chance for social interaction as the community stirred back to life. You might even see a sunset stroll becoming a popular Kushite social custom, where families and neighbors would emerge from their homes as the air cooled not just for a bit of gentle exercise, but to share the day's news, admire the changing colors of the sky over the Nile or the desert, and maybe show off any new beads or a freshly woven sash. The ancient equivalent of scrolling through your neighborhood Facebook feed, but with significantly better scenery and actual human interaction. And then came the night. As we've discussed, those flat rooftops often became communal bedrooms, offering the coolest place to sleep under the vast starry sky. But the evening and early night were also prime time for socializing, for storytelling, for music, and perhaps dance. The oppressive weight of the day's heat would lift, replaced by a gentle, embracing coolness, perfect for community gatherings and strengthening social bonds. Life didn't just stop when the sun went down. It simply shifted its focus, embracing the kinder temperament of the nocturnal hours. This beautiful practical rhythm, dictated by the sun and the seasons, was the invisible architecture that shaped Kushite daily existence, ensuring that life was lived not in constant battle with the heat, but in a wise and respectful harmony with it. You've seen how the ancient Kushites masterfully orchestrated their daily lives around the sun's commanding rhythm, finding coolness in the early mornings and late evenings and retreating to their intelligently designed homes during the midday blaze. This behavioral adaptation was crucial. But what about the very clothes on their backs? In a land where the sun's embrace could quickly turn from warm to scorching, your choice of attire wasn't just about fashion or modesty, it was a personal wearable climate control system. The Kushites, with their characteristic blend of practicality and artistry, knew precisely how to dress for the heat. The star player in the ancient Kushite wardrobe, much like in neighboring Egypt, was linen. This remarkable textile woven from the fibers of the flax plant was perfectly suited to the hot, dry climate. Imagine the feel of fine, cool linen against your skin. It's lightweight, it's breathable, allowing air to circulate and moisture to evaporate. And it wicks perspiration away from the body, helping you feel cooler and drier. Plus, it dries quickly, a handy feature if you happen to get caught in an unexpected Nile spray, or more likely just needed to wash your garments frequently in the heat. While wool was known and used likely for cooler nights for blankets or perhaps for certain ceremonial garments, by the elite and cotton began to appear more frequently in the later Meroitic period. Through trade and possibly local cultivation, linen reigned supreme for everyday cool comfort. Animal skins also had their place perhaps for specific work attire for certain nomadic groups, or as part of ritual costumes, but for general wear linen was the go-to. Now, what styles did they favor? Think loose-flowing and minimal. The aim was to allow as much air as possible to circulate around the body. For men, particularly laborers or those engaged in physical activity, a simple kilt or loincloth wrapped around the waist and falling to the knees or mid-thigh was common. This offered maximum freedom of movement and, of course, excellent ventilation, though perhaps it could get a bit breezy on a surprisingly chilly desert night if you weren't careful. Over this, or as a standalone garment, a loose-fitting tunic, often sleeveless or with wide short sleeves, would be worn. Women are often depicted in long, elegant, sheath-like dresses, which, while appearing form-fitting, were likely made from fine, flexible linen that allowed for movement and breathability. They also wore draped robes and shawls which could be artfully arranged to provide coverage from the sun while still allowing air to flow. These draped garments were wonderfully versatile. You could adjust them as the temperature changed or as your activity levels varied. Light colors, especially white or natural off-white linen, were predominant. Just as a whitewashed building reflects solar radiation, light-colored clothing helps to reflect the sun's rays, absorbing less heat than darker fabrics. It's a simple but effective principle that the Kushites understood well. The precise social distinctions, indicated by variations in Kushite clothing, documented in tomb depictions and statuary beyond the obvious quality and ornamentation of materials. Finer weaves, more elaborate pleating or decorative borders for the wealthy and powerful, particularly for non-elite individuals whose actual garments rarely survive the millennia, are still being pieced together by researchers comparing artistic representations with the few precious textile fragments that have been preserved. It's a complex puzzle trying to dress an ancient society from such tantalizingly incomplete clues. What about their heads and feet? Protecting your head from the direct impact of the sun was crucial. Simple cloth wraps. Perhaps a length of linen wound around the head would have been common. More elaborate headdresses, sometimes incorporating symbolic elements or precious materials, would signify status or religious roles. For footwear, sandals were the order of the day if footwear was worn at all. Many Kushites, especially in rural areas or within their own homes, likely went barefoot much of the time, the cool earth or a woven mat beneath their feet. When sandals were worn, they were typically simple constructions of woven reeds, palm fibers, or leather with straps to hold them onto the foot, allowing the feet to remain as cool and unrestricted as possible. And no discussion of Kushite attire would be complete without mentioning their love for jewelry. Beads of faience, a type of glazed ceramic carnelian amethyst jasper, and of course gold, were fashioned into intricate necklaces, broad collars, bracelets, anklets, and earrings. While primarily for adornment status and perhaps amuletic protection, it's fun to imagine that some of these items might have offered a tiny, fleeting sensation of coolness. Those faience beads, for instance, being ceramic, would feel cool against warm skin, at least initially. It's even been whimsically suggested by some that certain types of wide, flat Kushite beaded collars, apart from their undeniable beauty and indication of wealth, might have subtly helped to shade the collarbones and neck from the sun. Probably not their main purpose, but a hot day might make you appreciate any small comfort. If your necklace was particularly heavy with gold and stones, however, the sheer effort of wearing it might just make you warmer, so it was always a delicate balance of style and potential sweat. Some tomb depictions, particularly from the Meroitic period, show Kushite royalty and elites in what appear to be intricately pleated linen garments. These elaborate folds and drapes would have looked incredibly chic, a testament to the skill of their weavers and launderers. It's also conceivable that those very pleats beyond their aesthetic appeal might have inadvertently created tiny air channels close to the skin, promoting a sort of micro-ventilation. An ancient haute couture cooling system, if you will. Whether intentional or a happy byproduct, it all contributed to navigating life in their sun-blessed, beautiful, and often very warm land with grace and ingenuity. You've dressed yourself in your mind's eye in the cool, breathable linen of ancient Kush, feeling how every fold and drape was a subtle negotiation with the sun's pervasive warmth. From the grand scale of city planning down to the intimate choices of daily attire, the Kushites demonstrated a remarkable attunement to their environment. Their entire civilization, flourishing for well over 1,000 years in the heart of Nubia, was a masterclass in how to live, not just in, but with the heat. And as our sleepy journey through their world draws towards its close, it's worth reflecting on how this ancient cool, this ingenious legacy of passive climate control still resonates with us today, offering quiet lessons for our own often much hotter modern world. Think back to the core strategies we've explored. The humble mud brick, that ubiquitous building block with its incredible thermal mass, patiently absorbing the day's heat and releasing it into the cool night. The inward-looking courtyard houses creating private oases of shade and gentle airflow. The narrow, winding city streets designed like canyons of coolness, minimizing solar exposure. Those small, high windows, cleverly placed to admit soft, indirect light while keeping the direct, hot glare at bay. And those versatile flat roofs transforming from daytime sun shields into breezy nocturnal living rooms under the vast starry sky. Then there was their astute management of water, from the life-giving Nile to the community Hafirs, and the understanding of evaporative cooling that turned a simple porous jar into a miniature refrigerator. We saw how their daily rhythms, the early morning industry, the midday siesta, the evening resurgence of activity, were perfectly synchronized with the sun's energy. And finally, their clothing, those light, loose garments of linen allowing their skin to breathe. It's a comprehensive, holistic approach to comfort. What's truly remarkable is that these solutions were achieved without a single watt of electricity, without any complex machinery. They were born from careful observation, from generations of experience, from a deep understanding of local materials and natural processes. The Kushites worked with nature, not against it. Theirs was a low-energy, sustainable approach to creating comfort, a stark contrast to our modern reliance on hermetically sealed buildings and power-hungry air conditioning units. We press a button. They built an entire civilization that breathed with the desert. Slightly different skill sets, wouldn't you say? And here's the beautiful part. This ancient wisdom is far from obsolete. In fact, many of the principles the Kushites intuitively employed are now being rediscovered and championed by contemporary architects and urban planners under banners like passive solar design, green building, and sustainable development. That Kushite farmer deciding where to plant a valuable shade tree next to their home. They were engaging in a form of sophisticated microclimate design that modern urban planners now model with complex software, though sometimes the ancient wisdom still holds its own charm. The concept of thermal mass, so central to Kushite mudbrick architecture, is a cornerstone of energy-efficient building today, helping to reduce heating and cooling loads. Natural ventilation, encouraged by courtyard designs and strategic window placement, is increasingly recognized as a healthier and more sustainable alternative to sealed, mechanically ventilated buildings. Even mud brick itself, in the form of adobe or compressed earth blocks, is seeing a resurgence as a sustainable, low-impact building material. It turns out your great-great-great add quite a few more greats for good measure. Grandparents, in a way, knew a thing or two about sustainable living, even if they didn't have a trendy name for it. Those narrow, shaded streets of ancient Kushite cities offer profound lessons for combating the urban heat island effect that plagues many modern metropolises, where vast expanses of concrete and asphalt absorb and radiate solar heat, making our cities significantly hotter than the surrounding countryside. Designing for shade, incorporating green spaces, and considering the orientation and width of streets are all crucial for creating more livable, cooler urban environments. How effectively these ancient passive cooling strategies, like those so skillfully developed in Kush, can be scaled up and integrated into modern high-density urban environments in different climatic zones, all while meeting contemporary comfort expectations and stringent building codes, is a significant challenge and an active area of ongoing research for architects, engineers, and urban designers. But the inspiration is undeniably there. The legacy of Kushite coal is more than just a collection of clever building techniques. It's a mindset. It's about resourcefulness, about respecting the limits and gifts of your environment, and about finding elegant, simple solutions to complex problems. It reminds us that human ingenuity can create comfort and beauty even in the most challenging of circumstances, and that sometimes the most sophisticated technology is a deep understanding of the natural world. Their ability to thrive to build monumental temples, bustling cities, and a powerful kingdom that endured for centuries, all while keeping their cool, is a testament to their enduring quiet genius. As we leave the land of Kush, perhaps the soft desert wind carries a whisper of their ancient knowledge, a gentle reminder that the principles of living in harmony with our climate are timeless. The challenges of heat and energy are more pressing than ever in our modern world, and looking back at how these ancient peoples not only survived, but flourished, might just offer us some of the coolest ideas yet. And so the story of how ancient Kushite cities kept cool, a tale woven from mud and wisdom, from sun and shade, now gently draws to a close. The bustling markets of Kurma, the sacred precincts of Napata, the industrious heart of Meroe, all now settle into the quiet dust of millennia. Their ingenious ways of life, a soft echo in the vast expanse of the Nubian desert. You've walked their shaded alleys, rested in their cool courtyards, and felt the rhythm of their sun-guided days. The deep, velvety darkness of the desert night has now fully enveloped you, much like it did for those who slept on Kushite rooftops so long ago under the same silent, watchful stars. The heat of our story has long since dissipated, replaced by a gentle, pervasive calm. Let the ingenuity and resilience of these ancient people be a soothing thought, a testament to how humanity can adapt and find comfort, even in the most demanding of embraces from nature. The soft background hum you might have from your fan can be the whisper of the desert wind carrying away any lingering thoughts of the day. There is only stillness now, only peace. Allow your mind to drift as smoothly and quietly as the Nile itself on a windless night towards a deep and truly restful sleep. The echoes of ancient lives are fading, and only your own gentle breath remains in the quiet of your resting place.